The first time I stepped off that plane at Suvarnabhumi Airport in Bangkok, I had no idea my life was about to change forever. It was just supposed to be a holiday, a 2-week escape from the grey monotony of Manchester, from the endless drizzle and the soul-crushing routine that had become my existence. I was 47 years old, overweight, divorced, and working in a dead-end job that barely paid the bills. My doctor had been warning me about my blood pressure for months, and my knees ached every morning when I dragged myself out of bed. Thailand was meant to be a brief respite, nothing more than a chance to drink cheap beer in the sun and maybe lose myself in the chaos of a foreign country for a fortnight. The divorce had been finalised 18 months earlier, after 22 years of marriage that had slowly deteriorated into polite indifference and then not-so-polite resentment. Sarah had kept the house, naturally, along with most of our savings and the better car. I had moved into a cramped one-bedroom flat above a kebab shop in Rushom, where the smell of grilled meat and onions permeated everything I owned. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbours arguing in at least 3 different languages, and the heating barely worked during the bitter Manchester winters. It was the kind of place you ended up when life had beaten you down and you had stopped believing things could get better. My job at the call centre was the professional equivalent of that flat. 8 hours a day in a converted warehouse, sitting in a cubicle barely large enough for my desk and chair, fielding complaints from customers who were angry about their phone bills or internet service. The fluorescent lights gave everyone a sickly pallor, and the air conditioning system had been broken for so long that nobody bothered reporting it anymore. My supervisor was a 26-year-old business studies graduate named Ashley, who wore cheap suits and spoke in management jargon she had learned from YouTube videos. She treated everyone over 40 like we were dinosaurs waiting for extinction, which perhaps we were. The holiday to Thailand had been an impulse purchase, booked during a particularly dark moment in February when the rain had been falling for 6 straight days and I had not seen the sun for what felt like weeks. I had been scrolling through travel websites during my lunch break, looking at destinations I could never afford, when I found a package deal to Bangkok that was just within my budget if I ate nothing but instant noodles for the next 2 months. Something about the photos of golden temples and tropical beaches spoke to a part of me that I thought had died years ago, the part that still believed in possibility and adventure. But the moment I walked out of that air-conditioned terminal into the humid Bangkok night, something shifted inside me. The air was thick and warm, carrying scents I had never experienced before, a mixture of street food, incense, and tropical flowers that seemed to wrap around me like a welcoming embrace. The temperature was probably 30 degrees Celsius, but after months of Manchester cold, it felt like stepping into paradise. My clothes stuck to my skin immediately, but instead of being uncomfortable, it felt liberating, like my body was finally waking up after a long hibernation. The city pulsed with an energy that was completely foreign to anything I had known in England. Neon signs blazed in Thai script I could not read, creating a kaleidoscope of colours that painted the streets in electric blues and hot pinks. Tuk-tuks weaved through traffic with reckless abandon, their drivers calling out to tourists in broken English, mixed with cheerful Thai phrases. Everywhere there were people, smiling, laughing, living their lives with an intensity that made my quiet Manchester existence seem like a black and white photograph suddenly exposed to brilliant colour. The sounds were overwhelming at first. Car horns honked constantly, but somehow without the aggression I was used to in British traffic. Street vendors called out their wares in sing-song Thai voices. Music spilled out of shops and restaurants, everything from traditional Thai folk songs to American pop hits to electronic dance music that made the pavement vibrate under my feet. It was chaos, but it was joyful chaos. The sound of a city fully alive at every hour of the day and night. I had booked a modest hotel in the Sukhumvit area. Nothing fancy, just a clean room with air conditioning and a bed. The guidebooks had warned me about the nightlife in this part of Bangkok, the bars and the girls and the temptations that awaited unsuspecting tourists. I told myself I was different, that I was just there to see the temples and eat the food and maybe take a few photographs to show my mates back home. But even as I checked into my hotel, I could feel the pull of the neon lights visible from my window, the promise of experiences that existed nowhere in my carefully ordered British life. The hotel itself was a revelation. For what I was paying, barely £40 a night, I had a room that was larger and cleaner than my flat in Manchester. The bed was comfortable, the shower had hot water that never ran out, and the air conditioning worked perfectly. The staff spoke enough English to be helpful, but were so polite and deferential that I felt like royalty. In Manchester, I was just another middle-aged nobody. Here, I was a valued guest, someone worthy of smiles and attention. On my second night, jet-lagged and restless, I found myself wandering down Sukhumvit Road as the sun set and the neon began to flicker to life. The transformation was remarkable. During the day, Sukhumvit was busy but relatively ordinary, filled with office workers and shoppers going about their daily business. But as darkness fell, it became something else entirely. A carnival of lights and sounds and possibilities that seemed to exist in a different dimension from the daytime world. That is when I discovered Soy Cowboy, that narrow alley lined with go-go bars and beer bars that has become legendary among expats and tourists alike. The name itself conjured images of the Wild West, and walking down that neon-lit corridor for the first time felt like entering a frontier town where normal rules did not apply. The bars spilled out onto the sidewalk, their music mixing together into a symphony of bass lines and Thai pop songs. Girls in short skirts and high heels stood outside each establishment, calling out greetings to passing men in English, German, Japanese, and half a dozen other languages. I was nervous, I admit. At 47, I had not been in a bar like this since my university days. And even then, nothing in Manchester had prepared me for the sensory overload of Soy Cowboy. But something about the atmosphere was welcoming rather than threatening. The girls were not aggressive or pushy. They smiled and waved, but they did not grab at me or make me feel uncomfortable. It was more like walking through a friendly neighborhood where everyone was happy to see you. The first bar I entered was called Lucky Star, a typical beer bar with a handful of plastic chairs and tables arranged around a small stage. The music was not too loud, just background pop songs mixed with some Thai ballads, and the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. Unlike the go-go bars with their flashing lights and pole dancing, this felt more like a neighborhood pub that happened to be staffed entirely by attractive young women. Behind the bar stood 3 Thai women, all in their 20s or 30s, wearing simple jeans and t-shirts, chatting among themselves in rapid Thai, punctuated by bursts of laughter. When I sat down at the bar, one of them approached me with a smile that seemed genuinely warm rather than the professional greeting I had expected. Her name was Noi, she told me in careful English, and she asked where I was from and how long I was staying in Thailand. Her English was limited, but enthusiastic, and she seemed genuinely curious about my answers, rather than just making small talk to encourage me to buy drinks. We started talking, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversation in a way I had not experienced with a woman in years. She was curious about England, about the weather and the food and what life was like there. She laughed when I described the Manchester rain, covering her mouth with her hand in the Thai way, and her eyes widened when I told her about snow and how cold it could get in winter. In return, she told me about her village in Isan, about her family and her dreams of opening a small restaurant someday. Her father grew rice, she said, but the money was never enough, which was why she had come to Bangkok to work in the bars. It was honest work, she insisted, and it allowed her to send money home to help support her parents and her younger brother, who was still in school. What struck me most was how natural it all felt. There was no pressure, no aggressive sales pitch, no sense that I was being hustled or manipulated. Noi brought me cold bottles of Leo beer, the condensation running down the glass in the humid air, and we talked for hours about everything and nothing. She asked about my job, and when I described the call centre, she made a face of sympathy that was so genuine it almost brought tears to my eyes. Nobody in Manchester had ever shown that kind of empathy for my daily struggles. Other customers came and went, mostly middle-aged Western men like myself, and they all seemed to know each other, exchanging greetings and stories like old friends gathering at their local pub. There was Dave, a retired plumber from Yorkshire with a thick accent and a belly that suggested he enjoyed his beer. Jim was a former accountant from Australia, quieter than Dave but with a dry sense of humour and an encyclopedic knowledge of Thai visa regulations. Both men had been living in Thailand for years, and they welcomed me into their conversation without question or judgment. As the night wore on, I realised something profound was happening to me. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt truly relaxed. The constant tension I carried in my shoulders began to melt away. The anxiety that had become my constant companion back in Manchester seemed to evaporate in the warm night air. I was not thinking about my mortgage or my job or my ex-wife or any of the 1,000 small worries that usually occupied my mind. I was simply present, in the moment, enjoying a conversation with interesting people in an exotic location halfway around the world. The transformation was almost physical. My breathing slowed and deepened. The tight knot in my stomach that I had carried for so long began to unwind. Even my chronic back pain, which had been bothering me for months, seemed to fade away. It was as if my body was remembering what it felt like to be at peace, to exist without the constant stress and tension that had become my normal state of being. When I finally left the bar around midnight, Noi gave me her phone number and told me to come back soon. She seemed to mean it, not in the way of someone trying to secure a customer, but in the way of someone who had genuinely enjoyed my company and hoped to see me again. Walking back to my hotel through the bustling streets, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed. A sense of possibility, of adventure, of being alive in a way that had nothing to do with the mundane responsibilities that dominated my life back home. The streets were still busy despite the late hour. Food vendors were serving steaming bowls of noodles to night shift workers and partygoers. Massage parlors advertised traditional Thai massage with neon signs and photos of serene-looking therapists. Convenience stores blazed with fluorescent light, their shelves stocked with everything from instant noodles to Buddhist amulets. It was a city that never slept. But unlike London or New York, there was nothing frantic or desperate about the late-night energy. People moved with purpose but without urgency, as if they had all the time in the world to enjoy whatever the night might bring. The next day I explored Bangkok properly, visiting the Grand Palace and Wat Pho, taking a boat trip along the Chao Phraya River, sampling street food from vendors who spoke no English but communicated through smiles and gestures. The Grand Palace was everything the guidebooks had promised. A stunning complex of golden spires and intricate murals that spoke to centuries of Thai culture and artistry. But what impressed me most was not the architecture, magnificent as it was, but the way Thai people interacted with their heritage. Families came to make offerings at the temples, not as tourists, but as believers, their reverence genuine and moving. Wat Pho, the temple of the reclining Buddha, was equally impressive but in a different way. The massive golden statue stretched 46 meters long, its serene expression somehow managing to convey both peace and wisdom. I spent an hour sitting in that temple, not praying exactly, but allowing myself to absorb the atmosphere of calm that seemed to emanate from the ancient stones. For the first time in years, I felt connected to something larger than myself, something that transcended the petty concerns and frustrations of daily life. The street food was another revelation entirely. In Manchester, my diet consisted mainly of microwave meals and takeaway curries, food that was fuel rather than pleasure. But in Bangkok, even the simplest street vendor meal was an explosion of flavors I had never experienced. Pad Thai from a cart on Sukhumvit Road, prepared by a woman who must have been 70 years old, but moved with the precision of a master chef. Som Tam, green papaya salad that was simultaneously sweet, sour, salty, and spicy in ways that made my taste buds sing. Mango sticky rice that was so perfectly balanced between fruit and coconut that it seemed like a gift from the gods themselves. But as evening approached, I found myself drawn back to Sukhumvit, back to that little bar where Noi worked. This time, I stayed even later, and this time, I was not the only regular customer. Dave and Jim were there again, and they introduced me to others in their circle. There was Frank, a German engineer who had retired early and bought a condo in Bangkok. Peter, a former teacher from Scotland who now gave private English lessons to Thai businessmen. Mark, an American who had started an online business selling handmade Thai crafts to customers back home. They welcomed me into their circle without question, sharing stories of their own journeys to Thailand, the mistakes they had made, the lessons they had learned. Dave told me about his first visit 15 years earlier, how he had come for a 2-week holiday and ended up extending his trip 3 times before finally admitting to himself that he never wanted to leave. He had gone back to Yorkshire to settle his affairs, sold his house and most of his possessions, and returned to Thailand with 2 suitcases and a determination to start over at the age of 55. Jim described the freedom he felt living on his pension, in a country where his money went 3 times as far, where the weather was always warm, where people smiled at strangers, and life moved at a more humane pace. He had been an accountant in Melbourne for 30 years, working 60-hour weeks and living for the 2 weeks of vacation he could afford each year. Now, he woke up when he wanted, spent his days reading books in air-conditioned cafes and his evenings socializing with friends who had chosen the same path he had. Frank talked about the business opportunities he had discovered in Thailand, the gaps in the market that a Westerner with capital and connections could fill. He had invested in a small factory that made furniture for export, employing 20 Thai workers and providing a steady income that allowed him to live comfortably while contributing to the local economy. It was not about getting rich, he explained, but about finding a sustainable way to support the lifestyle he wanted while being useful to his adopted country. As my holiday progressed, I fell into a routine that felt more natural than anything I had experienced in years. I would spend my days exploring the city, visiting temples and markets, taking cooking classes and Thai massage courses. The cooking class was particularly memorable, held in a traditional Thai house with a garden full of herbs and vegetables. Our instructor, a middle-aged Thai woman named Kun Porn, taught us not just recipes, but the philosophy behind Thai cuisine, the balance of flavors and textures that reflected the Buddhist concept of harmony in all things. The Thai massage course was equally enlightening. I had always thought of massage as a luxury, something you got at expensive spas when you had money to waste. But traditional Thai massage, I learned, was actually a form of healing that combined elements of yoga, acupressure, and meditation. The ancient practitioners had understood something that Western medicine was only beginning to rediscover, that the body and mind were inseparable, and that physical tension was often a manifestation of emotional stress. But my evenings belonged to that little corner of Sukhumvit, to the beer bar where Noi worked, and where I had found a community of expatriate men who had all made the same discovery I was making, that Thailand offered something that their home countries could not provide. It was not just about the women, though I would be lying if I said that was not part of the attraction. The bar girls were friendly and attentive in a way that Western women had never been with me, at least not in recent years. They listened to my stories without judgment, laughed at my jokes even when they were not particularly funny, and made me feel interesting and desirable in a way I had forgotten was possible. Noi would remember details from our previous conversations, asking about my work or my family with genuine interest. When I mentioned that I had been feeling tired lately, she suggested I try a traditional Thai herbal remedy her grandmother had taught her. When I complained about my knee pain, she recommended a massage therapist who specialized in sports injuries. But it was more than that. It was the entire culture, the way people interacted with each other, the respect for elders, the Buddhist philosophy that seemed to permeate daily life, the sense that happiness was not something to be pursued in some distant future, but something to be experienced in each moment. Thai people had a phrase, sanuk, that roughly translated to fun or enjoyment, but it carried deeper implications about the proper way to live. Work should be sanuk, relationships should be sanuk, even mundane activities like shopping for groceries should contain elements of joy and social connection. This was radically different from the British approach to life, where suffering was seen as noble and pleasure was viewed with suspicion. In Manchester, people took pride in their misery, competing to see who had the worst commute or the most unreasonable boss. Complaining was a form of social bonding, and anyone who expressed genuine happiness was viewed as naive or delusional. But in Thailand, the opposite was true. People who were chronically unhappy were seen as failures, not because they lacked material success, but because they had failed to master the art of living. By the end of my first week, I knew I was in trouble. The thought of returning to Manchester, to my cramped flat and my meaningless job and the endless grey skies, filled me with a dread so profound it was almost physical. I started researching visa options, looking into the cost of living, trying to figure out if it was possible for someone like me to make a life in Thailand. The numbers were encouraging. My pension, when I eventually qualified for it, would go much further in Thailand than it ever would in England. The cost of rent, food and healthcare was a fraction of what I was paying back home. A decent apartment in Bangkok, something far nicer than my Manchester flat, could be rented for the equivalent of £300 a month. Street food meals cost less than £2 each, and even restaurant dining was affordable by British standards. Healthcare was not only cheaper, but often superior to what was available on the NHS, with shorter waiting times and more personalised attention. The numbers suggested that I could live comfortably in Thailand on half of what I was spending to barely survive in Manchester, but I was not yet retirement age, and that presented a significant challenge. Tourist visas would only allow me to stay for limited periods, and the visa runs to neighbouring countries that Dave and Jim described sounded exhausting and expensive. Work permits were nearly impossible to obtain for someone my age without specialised skills or significant capital to invest in a business. The Thai government, understandably, wanted to protect jobs for Thai citizens and was selective about which foreigners they allowed to work legally. The more I researched, the more frustrated I became with the bureaucratic obstacles that stood between me and the life I was beginning to envision for myself. Education visas required enrollment in language schools or universities, which was expensive and time-consuming. Investment visas required capital I did not possess. Marriage visas were possible, but required a level of commitment I was not ready to make, despite my growing affection for Noi and the other women I had met. On my last night in Bangkok, I sat in that same beer bar, nursing a Leo and trying to memorize every detail of the scene around me. The way the neon light from the street filtered through the open front of the bar, casting everything in a pink and blue glow. The sound of Noi laughing with her co-workers behind the bar, their voices rising and falling in musical Thai tones. The comfortable chatter of the other customers, men who had found their way to this corner of the world and made it their home. The smell of grilled meat from the street food vendor just outside, mixing with the cigarette smoke and the faint scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby. I knew I would be back. The question was not if, but when and how. As I packed my bags the next morning, my clothes now carrying the scent of Thailand, that mixture of humidity and spice and possibility, I made myself a promise. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning. I would find a way to make this work. I would find a way to build a life in this country that had awakened something in me I thought was dead forever. The flight back to Manchester was torture. Every mile that carried me further from Thailand felt like a small death. The aircraft itself seemed to be conspiring against me. The recycled air growing colder and more sterile as we flew west, the meals becoming increasingly bland and processed. Even the passengers seemed to change as we approached Europe, their faces growing more closed and suspicious, their conversations more guarded and pessimistic. The grey skies and cold rain that greeted me at Manchester Airport seemed not just unwelcoming, but actively hostile. The immigration officer barely looked at me, stamping my passport with mechanical efficiency. The taxi driver complained about traffic and weather, and the state of the country with a bitterness that seemed to seep into my bones. Everything felt smaller, meaner, more constrained than it had just 24 hours earlier. My flat, which had never been particularly cheerful, now felt like a prison cell. The silence was oppressive after the constant hum of activity that had surrounded me in Bangkok. Even the air felt different, thin and lifeless compared to the rich, humid atmosphere I had been breathing for 2 weeks. The heating was not working properly, and the smell of grease from the kebab shop downstairs seemed stronger than ever. I sat on my narrow bed, surrounded by the detritus of my old life, and felt something close to despair. My first day back at work was a nightmare. The call centre, where I spent my days, was located in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a soulless building surrounded by empty parking lots and chain restaurants. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher than I remembered, casting everyone in an unhealthy pallor. My cubicle felt smaller, more cramped, like a cage designed to contain rather than facilitate productivity. My job involved sitting in that cubicle for 8 hours a day, answering calls from customers who were usually angry about their mobile phone bills or internet service. The work was mind-numbing, the pay was barely adequate, and my supervisor was a 20-something graduate who treated everyone over 40 like we were relics from a bygone era. But now, having experienced what life could be like, the job felt not just boring, but actively offensive to my sense of human dignity. I found myself daydreaming about Thailand constantly, replaying conversations with Noi and the other bar girls, remembering the taste of pad thai from a street vendor, feeling the warm night air on my skin as I walked back to my hotel. My co-workers noticed the change in me immediately. Where I had once been resigned to my fate, now I was restless and distracted. I started taking longer lunch breaks, spending time on Thai visa websites instead of working, counting down the hours until I could go home and research flights back to Bangkok. Ashley, my supervisor, called me into her office after my first week back. She was wearing one of her cheap business suits and had adopted the concerned but authoritative tone she had learned from management training videos. My performance had declined noticeably, she said. My call resolution times were up, my customer satisfaction scores were down, and several colleagues had reported that I seemed disengaged and unfocused. Was there anything going on in my personal life that might be affecting my work? I wanted to tell her about Thailand, about the discovery that life could be beautiful and meaningful and full of joy. I wanted to explain that sitting in this fluorescent lit box for 8 hours a day felt like a form of slow suicide. That every moment I spent here was a moment stolen from the life I now knew was possible. But I also knew that she would not understand, that to her, my dissatisfaction would seem like ingratitude or mental instability. So I mumbled something about jet lag and promised to do better, knowing even as I said it that the promise was meaningless. The physical contrast was even more jarring than the emotional one. In Thailand, despite drinking beer every night and eating rich, spicy food, I had felt healthier than I had in years. The constant walking in the humid heat had been like a natural sauna, and I had actually lost weight during my 2-week stay. My skin had cleared up, my chronic back pain had disappeared, and even my blood pressure had seemed to normalise. But back in Manchester, sitting in my cubicle under fluorescent lights, eating sandwiches from the office canteen, I felt my body deteriorating rapidly. My blood pressure, which had seemed to normalise in Thailand, shot back up to dangerous levels within days of my return. My knees, which had stopped aching in the warm climate, resumed their daily protest against my morning routine. The weight I had lost in Thailand came back with interest, and my skin took on the grey pallor of someone who rarely saw natural sunlight. My doctor, a stern Scottish woman who had been warning me about my health for years, was not surprised by the deterioration. She increased my blood pressure medication and suggested I consider joining a gym, advice that felt laughably inadequate given what I now knew was possible. How could I explain to her that what I needed was not a gym membership, but a complete change of environment, a different way of living that prioritized happiness and human connection over productivity and financial security? The isolation was perhaps the worst part. In Thailand, one had been surrounded by people, by conversation, by a sense of community that I had never experienced before. The bar where Noi worked had become like a second home, a place where I was known and welcomed, where my presence mattered to someone. Back in Manchester, I was anonymous again. Just another middle-aged man shuffling through his daily routine without making any meaningful connections with the people around him. I tried to maintain contact with the friends I had made in Thailand through social media and messaging apps. Dave and Jim would send me photos from their latest adventures, updates from the bars and restaurants we had visited together, news about the girls we had met. These messages were both a lifeline and a form of torture, reminding me of what I was missing while highlighting how far away it all seemed from my current reality. Noi would message me occasionally, usually late at night, Manchester time, when it was early morning in Bangkok. She would tell me about her day, ask how I was feeling, share photos of new dishes she had tried or places she had visited on her days off. Her messages were warm and genuine, but they also made my current situation feel even more unbearable. Here was someone who cared about my well-being, who remembered details about my life and asked thoughtful questions, and she was 8,000 miles away while I sat alone in my dreary flat above a kebab shop. The financial calculations became an obsession. I spent hours every evening working out different scenarios, trying to figure out how I could afford to return to Thailand permanently. My salary from the call centre job was barely enough to cover my expenses in Manchester, let alone save for a major life change. My mortgage still had 8 years remaining, and my pension would not kick in for another 13 years. The numbers seemed insurmountable, but I kept working them anyway, hoping to find some combination that would make my dream feasible. I started looking into remote work opportunities, jobs that would allow me to earn British wages while living in Thailand. The options were limited and mostly required skills I did not possess: web design, digital marketing, online teaching, all fields that seemed to require a complete career change at an age when most employers were already writing me off. I enrolled in some online courses, trying to teach myself the basics of website development, but the learning curve was steep, and my motivation was undermined by the daily grind of my current job. The visa situation was equally daunting. Tourist visas would allow me to stay in Thailand for 30 days at a time, but the constant visa runs to neighbouring countries would be expensive and exhausting. Education visas required enrolment in language schools that cost thousands of pounds per year. Investment visas required capital I did not have. Marriage visas required a level of commitment I was not ready to make, despite my growing affection for Noi and the other women I had met. As the months passed, my obsession with returning to Thailand began to affect every aspect of my life. I stopped socialising with my few friends in Manchester, partly because I had nothing in common with them anymore, and partly because spending money on nights out meant less money in my Thailand fund. I moved to a smaller, cheaper flat to reduce my expenses, trading what little comfort I had for the possibility of saving a few extra pounds each month. I sold my car and started taking the bus to work, another small sacrifice in service of my larger goal. The new flat was even more depressing than the old one. A studio apartment in a converted Victorian house where the walls were so thin I could hear every conversation, argument, and intimate moment of my neighbours' lives. The bathroom was shared with 2 other tenants, and the kitchen consisted of a hot plate and a mini refrigerator squeezed into what had once been a closet. But it was £50 a month cheaper than my previous place, and £50 a month was £200 closer to my next ticket to Bangkok. The irony was not lost on me that in trying to save money to return to a place where I'd felt alive, I was making my current life even more miserable than it had been before. But the alternative, accepting that my trip to Thailand had been a one-time experience and settling back into my old routine, was unthinkable. The memory of those warm nights in the beer bar, of feeling genuinely happy for the first time in years, sustained me through the darkest moments of my Manchester winter. I started planning my return trip almost immediately, even though I knew it would be at least a year before I could afford it. I researched different areas of Thailand, reading expat forums and travel blogs, trying to decide whether Bangkok was really the right place for me or if I should explore other options. Pattaya was cheaper and had a large expat community, but it also had a reputation for being somewhat seedy and transient. Chiang Mai offered a more authentic Thai experience and lower costs, but it lacked the vibrant nightlife that had been such a crucial part of my Bangkok experience. The more I researched, the more I realised how little I actually knew about Thailand beyond that small corner of Sukhumvit where I had spent most of my time. I had been a tourist, experiencing a very specific slice of expatriate life without really understanding the broader culture or the challenges that long-term residents faced. The forums were full of stories of expats who had burned through their savings, been scammed by business partners, or found themselves trapped in Thailand without the resources to return home or the legal status to stay permanently. But for every cautionary tale, there were also success stories, men who had found love, purpose and happiness in Thailand after lives of quiet desperation in their home countries. These stories fed my determination and helped me rationalise the risks I was considering taking. If they could do it, why could I not do it too? What made them different from me, other than the courage to take the leap when the opportunity presented itself? The planning became a form of meditation, a way to escape the drudgery of my daily routine and focus on something positive and forward-looking. I created spreadsheets tracking my savings, researched apartment rentals in different Thai cities, studied visa requirements and renewal procedures. I even started learning basic Thai phrases, practicing the tonal pronunciation in my empty flat, imagining the day when I could have real conversations with the people I met, instead of relying on their limited English. Learning Thai was more challenging than I had expected. The tonal nature of the language meant that the same syllable could have completely different meanings depending on how it was pronounced. Ma could mean mother, horse, dog, or come, depending on the tone. But there was something deeply satisfying about slowly mastering these subtle distinctions, about feeling my brain rewiring itself to accommodate new patterns of sound and meaning. As my second trip to Thailand approached, the anticipation was almost overwhelming. I had saved enough money for 3 weeks this time, and I had a much clearer idea of what I wanted to accomplish during my stay. This would not just be a holiday, it would be a reconnaissance mission, a chance to gather the information and make the connections I would need to eventually make the move permanent. The stakes felt higher this time, and the pressure I put on myself to make the most of every moment was intense. But underneath the excitement and planning was a growing sense of desperation. I was 48 years old, overweight, with high blood pressure, and a job I hated in a country that felt increasingly foreign to me. Time was not on my side, and the window of opportunity for making a major life change was closing with each passing year. If I was going to do this, it had to be soon, before age and circumstance made it impossible. The night before my flight, I sat in my sparse Manchester flat, surrounded by the detritus of a life I was increasingly eager to leave behind, and tried to imagine what I would be doing in a year. Would I still be in this same chair, in this same room, planning yet another trip to Thailand, while my dreams slowly died of neglect? Or would I have found the courage to burn my bridges and commit fully to the life I knew was waiting for me on the other side of the world? The answer, I knew, would depend on what happened in the next 3 weeks, and whether I could find a way to turn my desperate longing into a workable plan for escape.